You're listening to the Forever Pick Podcast with Bobby Paul. 1696. Let's go. Light 'em up!
Welcome to part 2 of A Danelectro Story, The Adventures of Nathan Daniel. Thank you, 1690, for doing my show introduction. 1690 is the godfather of sludge metal. He's been doing it a long time, and he's still probably one of the most powerful sounds I've ever heard. But he was also at the TERASYNE amplification booth all weekend, where I got to know him. And ironically, at the show, in my row, there was a lot of people who are famous to the famous. And most of those dudes were older than me. And when notable recording artists from yesteryear walk through the show, they all kind of beelined it for the TERASYNE booth. So TERASYNE is an amplification company that makes amps for the heaviest of heavy metal. But I saw a blues legend, obviously, by the way people were treating him, clearly over 80 years old, sitting down and jamming on that amp. No, I think they were the kind of the belle of the ball this weekend at the Amigo show, next to probably the Taylor guitar booth. It was a great show. The people at Amigo, Ruth and her boys, put on a great show. I want to thank them for their hospitality and their level of security, which is so amazing. But today we are in part 2 of the Adventures of Nathan Daniels. This is probably going to be a 3-part series because I have edited down at least 30 minutes of good information from a couple of people who are joining us in the story today. First being Brad the Guitologist, oddly enough, makes his money as a vintage ampologist. He fixes amps. Guitarologist meaning someone who studies guitars. That's a hobby of his, and he's very knowledgeable and shares that information freely. But he feeds his family as an ampologist, fixing these amps that he has studied. So if you don't have anyone in your general area who could fix an oddball amp, you might want to look to YouTube and find Brad the Guitologist and drop him a note and enjoy some of his content. I've been watching Brad for probably a year and a half. He's got some really interesting stuff. Ironically, we have something in common, that is finding the guitar in the garbage. For him, a dumpster. For me, a can. And we'll run that on another episode. That was an interesting conversation. Doug Tulloch is going to help us along in the filling in some details in the Nathan Daniel story. Doug Tulloch, the author of NEPTUNE Bound, and it's going to press for the second time with some new information. I want to get my hands on the old one. Doug is going to chime in, and between the conversation I had with those two gentlemen and possibly even someone from the factory, there's going to most likely end this with a third and final chapter to the Nathan Daniel story. But if you were at the show, you walked by my booth, you were we did great. By the way, I do need help at that booth because there were times when people had money in my face and I couldn't take it. We did great. I brought enough for the weekend. I brought twice as much product as I've ever taken to any show. And I went through 82% of my stock on the first day of the show by myself. And I want to thank everyone who came to my booth. I want to thank everyone who picked up that guitar and boldly took their guitar pick out of their pocket and compared it to the Forever pick and left my booth with Forever pick. And I believe there was one gentleman, the gentleman who actually does the tortoiseshell test. I actually had a guy come by with a bag of tortoiseshell, or of arrangement of picks that were antique picks. He's a collector of antique picks. And he allowed another gentleman to use that tortoiseshell pick to compare against my ebony pick. And the video on YouTube clearly indicates that I kicked tortoiseshell butt out of the pond. And I'm coming after Dunlop next, by the way. Mr. Dunlop, you could buy me out, or you could die by my blade on my Forever pick. Not in the literal sense. No, I'm not going to hurt anybody. Let's get on to the drawing. I think it's time. Anybody who came by my booth this weekend was well aware that I was giving away a couple of things I cannot sell, which are Brazilian rosewood that I ended up with when they changed the law in January, and I have to get a $300 permit to sell a $10 pick. And by the way, my picks aren't $10, but the rosewood pick being the most expensive Brazilian rosewood, that was $10. I'm not going to gouge you $140 like it's tortoiseshell. So I have a big giant vat here. What I did, if you entered this contest, this is what happened. I took out all of your entries and put them flat because I know all the little tricks. So let's get over. I'm going to grab. So I put everything in a big giant bucket so I could swirl it around. There was any age to enter, and there are no qualifications, and we will mail it to you with a tracking number. So let's get our hand inside the bin. All right. Our first winner is You Are Really Fat and Balding. That's not a name, and there's no email. You, why I oughta. That was rude. All right, let's get a real one. Our first winner is, for the Brazilian Rosewood guitar pick, Lisa Green at gmail.com. Oh, I'm not supposed to give that. Lisa Green, you are winner number 1 of the Brazilian Rosewood guitar pick. Okay, this guy didn't put his email address, which that's kind of important. So you're disqualified for not following instructions that were clearly written. I only had them in English, but I did have one Japanese dude stop at my booth from Japan. Our second winner is Scott Gagger, Gager, it appears to be. You are the second winner and the final winner in the Rosewood guitar pick. I want to thank everybody who entered. And now let's get to part 2 of the adventures of Nathan Daniel, a Danelectro Story.
At the beginning, when my dad founded the company in 1947 or shortly thereafter, he found tremendous clients in both Sears Roebuck and also Montgomery Ward. I'm guessing that a lot of people who may listen to this will have no idea what Montgomery Ward was. And he basically, in those days, my dad made his products, amplifiers and then guitars, for 3 clients. He made the Danelectro line, which he sold to wholesalers. He called them jobbers. And the second thing he did was he made basically the same amplifiers and later guitars for Sears. But the ones he made for Sears looked a little different. The circuits and everything were the same. And Sears sold them in its own stores and through its own catalog and put its own brand on them. So they didn't say Danelectro, they said Silvertone, which was a well-known Sears brand that was also applied to other kinds of things, electronics that Sears sold.
Yes, sir.
And then he also sold amplifiers to Montgomery Ward. He never did. Montgomery Ward never seemed to be interested in guitars, and so he never made guitars that were sold under the Montgomery Ward label. And that label, by the way, was called Airline. Once he started making guitars, which was in the early 1950s, I believe the year is 1953, he sold them both as Danelectro branded guitars and Silvertone branded guitars, which were sold to Sears. Well, if you were in the market for a guitar, you could buy a Silvertone or you could buy a Danelectro. You would pay a lot less for the Silvertone. And the reason for that, when Dad sold to Sears, he sold them to Sears for the same price that he sold them, Danelectro branded equipment, to the wholesalers.
The jobbers.
But when the wholesalers turned around and sold it to the retailers, there was an extra step that in which the price was marked up. By the time a Danelectro guitar arrived in a retail store someplace, its price had been marked up twice. Sears marked it up once. It didn't have to go through a wholesaler. Sears was both wholesaler and retailer in one, often at the factory. Even when other people weren't, he was noodling and thinking about designs. And
I do know this. I do know for a fact that Nathan Daniel was very early into guitar technology. I don't know for a fact. I mean, I've never found a patent, but like his son said, he never really patented anything, so I don't know. And I was surprised to read that Nat Daniel might have gotten there first. And I would be interested to see if anybody, especially, and here's what I wanted to do at one point. I actually wanted to travel to New Jersey and visit his old factory and go to the library there and see if I could dig up some of this stuff, so any information on him at all, because he is a very interesting figure in guitar history, and not just for the amplifier side, but for the guitar side and stuff too later on. Extremely interesting guy, and the way he builds all this stuff coming out of his factory, if you just pick it apart and you actually look at the materials that he was using and the methods with which everything was put together, he reminds me of my grandpa. My grandpa was born in like 1924, so he lived through the Depression. So he was one of these guys who would take a broken lawn chair and he would fix it with like hay baling wire, you know what I mean? And you'd be sitting on it for the next 15 years with hay baling wire, you know. But that's what Nat Daniel stuff reminds me of. If you actually look at it, some examples I can think of are the tuning keys on some of those 1960s guitars. If you look at them, all it is a piece of trim. It's like a piece of aluminum trim from like an Airstream factory or something. You know, the Airstream, like the trailers? Yeah. It's like a piece of trim or something from one of those maybe, or like from a pre-manufactured house, or like I don't know, maybe like an automobile factory cast off or something.
Now that you mention it, yeah.
Yeah, man, I'm really curious to know. I wanted to travel to New Jersey to try to figure some of this stuff out and piece together what factories were close to his factories. Because I think what he did was he went around to the factories that were nearby and said, "What do you throw away every day? What are your cast-offs?"
It was basically a friendly place. Everybody called my dad by his first name. They all called him Nat, and he knew them all and called them by their first names. And maybe not toward the end. I mean, by the end, he employed something over 500 people. So I suspect by that time he didn't know everybody by name, but he sure knew a lot of them. Anyhow, but there were none of them who fit the description of luthier or craftsman. They were good, solid journeyman employees who could wield a screwdriver and a soldering iron, or who knew how to put cloth covering on an amplifier case, or the cloth covering that went around the side of the guitar, and glue it so it would stick and it was not wrinkled and it looked just right. That helped produce an inexpensive instrument. I still remember the name of the person in charge of that covering area, and I remember the smell of the glue they used, which was, I kind of thought it was kind of interesting. I liked it, but...
That's how I feel about printer's ink back in the 70s when it was dangerous.
Yeah, I know.
I love the smell of that.
Yeah. Well, Sears, of course, wanted to bring in lots of guitars and amplifiers for sale around the time of the Christmas holidays. And so throughout the summer, the factory was usually working overtime to meet the demand, and they always had a bit of a backlog of orders. The fact that people would typically be asked to work an extra hour every day. Of course, they were paid overtime, time and a half of their normal wage, and usually several hours, I think, mornings on Saturdays. And I remember specifically there was a time when I guess the backlog was so big that people were asked if they could come in and work on Sundays. That was a very rare occasion that happened. And my dad shut down for a week in July. That's when the NAMM show takes place. You know, he would close the factory down and go with a couple of key people from the company to the NAMM show. While my dad and some of the other key people were not there, it was a good time to give everybody a week's vacation. People couldn't, the employees of my dad's company couldn't take vacation whenever they felt like it. They got a week's vacation.
Okay, now, as Howard puts it, there were some key players that would go to NAMM. That's just all he said. Vincent is one of those key players.
Sure.
Most of the people listening don't know who Vincent Bell was to the Danelectro Story. What do you know about him?
Vincent Bell was another guy there, another mind. He was well-footed in the local music scene, and played with Sinatra. And Vinny's contribution was brought in to develop along with Nat.
I ask myself, how does Nat get his pulse on the culture 22 years younger than him? So Vinny didn't have his pulse on it. Vinny was part of the pulse of the culture at that time. and he was helping design these guitars.
Vinny was an integral part of design in that era.
I went with him to the NAMM convention, usually in Chicago. Every 4 years it was held in New York. And I went with him up to the New York convention one year, whenever it was, when I was in my teen years. He realized that a lot of people who play guitars do it in a nightclub where maybe there's a neon sign in the window. And those neon signs make a lot of sonic interference and static. He figured out a way to inexpensively shield the insides of his amplifiers and his guitars. And he started doing this, I don't know, I was already in high school, and it was the year that he introduced total shielding. And he labeled it TS, standing for total shielding, but it also stands for, well, he was not above using the language himself when he was kidding around with colleagues and his teenage son, but TS also stands for, you should pardon the expression, tough shit. And it was tough shit on his competitors who weren't doing that. And so he created a guitar without the total shielding. He had one done without total shielding, and people would play the Danelectros, and he had a neon sign right there in the room, which which is creating a lot of interference. And when
for everybody around him.
Yeah, when anybody picked up a Danelectro to play, it sounded great. There was no interference. And then when people picked up he called it the Brand X, and it didn't look like any of his. It was not literally, say a Gibson or a Fender or a Harmony or a K or any one of those other guitars. He just put together a guitar without the total shielding, and he painted it to look different. And he called it Brand X. And whenever the person who was demonstrating the instruments in the Danelectro booth picked up the Brand X, he played it, and it sounded terrible. And I think he got some complaints from people just down the hall because
he's interfering with everybody
because of that neon sign. Yeah. I remember when he started making guitars, the question was, what do you use for the fingerboard? Well, one way or another, he figured out that it would be good to use rosewood, and they imported rosewood and from Brazil. Wow. I remember he went to the supplier of this rosewood, and that supplier told him a story that he brought home, told my mom and me at dinner one evening. Yeah. He'd been to the supplier, and the supplier said that when they got a shipment of rosewood from Brazil, they unbundled it or whatever, they opened it up, and out marched a tarantula. And that took everybody by surprise.
What do you do?
Yeah.
You can't step on a tarantula. It's a lot different.
They're about the same size, I think.
Your dad had several patents that are still relative.
Oh, he had a total of, I think, 8 patents altogether. There was an awful lot of stuff he did that he never patented. And
some of the most important stuff he didn't patent.
Yeah, well, I mean, like total shielding. I mean, these days everybody is shielding there, but he was several years ahead of his competitors. They just hadn't thought of it.
The innovations, I don't know if you remember some of the patents. Didn't they have to do with effects, some of them? He had effects in a couple of earlier.
He invented reverb. He invented vibrato. Just look at the article. It's got a list, and I haven't got them in my head. Some of them are more arcane than others. Oh, here's I think a really cool one. He invented the electric sitar.
My name's Lou Carlos. I'm a studio producer based in Chicago, and I'm a former music critic at the Chicago Tribune. Now, many people say that it's the effects pedal or the guitar that makes a huge difference, but I want to point out something before I go into this demo. Picks make a huge difference. Let's just say you have an ordinary pick and you play all the way by the bridge. Most guitar players know that that's going to have a different sound than if you play by the pickup or play up by the neck. However, the pick is often one of the most underrated aspects of playing. So what I'm going to do is take you through this Forever pick and let's test drive it. Let's see what it can do. Okay, are we kicked on? I can tell you right now from playing this pick, it does a better job of reproducing an old Fender sound and feel in terms of the amplifier than some of the boutique amplifiers that claim to Remarkably, you can't see the amp on camera. This is a Marshall. It is not a Fender. This is part of what the pick is doing in terms of the articulation. This is wonderful. This pick has made a believer out of me. I hope it makes a believer out of you. I'm Lou Carloso, Chicago-based record producer. I love it. The Forever pick. May it live forever.
I'm Ellsworth Wolf with TERASYNE Amplification, and you're listening to Forever Pick Podcast.
The Indian sitar, which sitar music became of interest here in the United States and elsewhere in the West after the Beatles went to India and got interested in Indian mysticism and also in Indian music. And the sitar is a wonderful Indian instrument, but even though it's a stringed instrument and has what you might call frets, it looks entirely different from a guitar. It is of completely different dimensions. The frets are spaced very differently, and if you know how to play the guitar, you don't necessarily know how to play the sitar. In fact, I would go further and say, if you can play the guitar, you cannot possibly play the sitar without learning an entirely new instrument. It would be basically like asking a guitarist to pick up a violin and play it. He figured out what it is that makes the sitar sound, have that distinctive sound.
Yeah.
What he did was the basic thing that makes the sitar sound the way it does, and has sort of a buzzy sound to it, is the fact that the bridge is not in a guitar. The strings end at the bridge at one end, and up at the end of the neck at the head they end at the nut, and those two places are firm. The string vibrates between point A and point B, between the bridge and the nut. In a sitar, the bridge is not a fixed point, let's say point A. The bridge of a sitar is slightly curved, so the string vibrates against the surface of the bridge, and that makes the string buzz against the bridge. And that produces the distinctive sound of the sitar. And so what he did was he created, basically he took the basic model of guitar, and instead of having a regular bridge, he put in a slightly curved bridge that would make the string buzz. But the neck was the same. If you can play guitar, you can play that sitar. So he called it the electric sitar, and his invention. Now, the two models that you talked about, there was a fancier model and a less fancy model. Fancier model, they also had what he referred to as drone strings. In addition to the 6 strings of a guitar, there were about a dozen other strings off to the side, mounted, in this case, from point A to some other point A to point B, on the body of the guitar. And they were not intended to be played. Instead, they just produced sympathetic vibrations because they picked up the vibrations of the strings that you play and produced additional sounds with lots and lots of harmonics. And of course, there was a pickup underneath it, so that added to the exotic sound of the sitar. So that was the more expensive model. You might have the book Neptune Bound, can see photographs of it. The ability to get a guitar inexpensively, and it was a good guitar, a very playable guitar. The neck was fabulous, and it had it was a slender neck, but very strong, never warped. My dad did not believe that truss rods that you find in most guitars to adjust the neck counteract the bowing action or the bowing pressure caused by the strings of a tuned-up guitar, which tend to want to make the neck bow. My dad didn't believe in having an adjustable truss rod. He believed in putting instead steel I-beams, 2 of them, inside the neck, and enclosing them so tightly in there that they made the neck unwarpable.
Yes. And a weapon, also. That's serious stuff. That's going to do a $35 guitar.
He didn't find the type of... He was looking for an I-beam, not just a piece of steel of a certain size. He was looking for an I-beam because an I-beam is basically stronger. I-beam was strong, and he bought these I-beams from an outfit that produced them in England, and he imported them from England. The I-beams inside a Danelectro neck were quite small, but they were still I-beams, and they had that kind of strength. We've basically heard of almost no complaints at all about Danelectro necks remaining true. And the action was good. These were good instruments, and they were affordable. So an awful lot of people got their start playing the guitar, and some of these people became well-known names. So I think it's fair to say that my dad got an awful lot of people started playing the instrument.
Who not only started with the guitar, but recorded with the guitar later.
Yeah, no, a number of people recorded with it, and some people are famous for using it.
I'm Randy Bachman. I sit here with my first guitar. I got my first guitar through in Winnipeg, Manitoba, through the Sears catalog. Saw this beautiful little black guitar and ordered one. This guitar pretty much changed rock and roll. It's used by most of the early bluesmen and rock and rollers. I still go to this guitar all the time when I'm making a record. It gets to sound like nothing else. It's the electric guitar that started the rock and roll revolution.
So, as a result, these quite good instruments, amplifiers and guitars that is, were available quite inexpensively.
I believe $35 was the introductory price.
Yeah, it was a great bargain. And as a result, an awful lot of young people, maybe not only young people, but in particular young people, had a Danelectro made guitar, usually a Silvertone, sold through Sears as their first or one of their first guitars.
Now, Howard mentioned Jimi Hendrix, Jerry Garcia.
Well, some of the my era guys, Aerosmith, Joe Perry, Brad Whitford. I sold Danos to Warren Haynes, all kind of. Greg Allman bought a Dano bass off me. So endlessly used the Longhorn. Played bass solo on My Generation. He used that. And yeah, they in England then they weren't plentiful, and he came across one and liked it and played it and broke the strings and went to get strings, couldn't find strings, had to buy another bass, and they didn't stock strings. And that's another thing Dano kind of innovated was string gauges in lieu of anybody else doing, just like the neck tilt or all the other innovations that came up with.
This guy gave us a lot.
Yeah, and in a short span of time.
Sometime after he passed away, when he did pass away, I pulled some information together and wrote what would be the makings of an obituary, and then sent it off to quite a few places, varying from the New York Times to Rolling Stone. And later, I was contacted by somebody by the name of Doug Tulloch, who is the fellow who created a book called NEPTUNE Bound, which is the most complete book on Danelectro that I'm aware of. He asked if I would write the introduction to it, which I did. I brought all kinds of information into it that I thought would be of interest to people interested in Danelectro guitars and also amplifiers, because my dad got into the music world basically through his interest in electronics, which basically initially took him into the design of amplifiers, even as a kid. Anyhow, so I wrote that introduction, and later I tweaked it just a little bit, and it is now on my website. And there's probably more good information there about Danelectro and my dad. And to put it in a nutshell, what makes Danelectro so interesting and has led to its the name and the brand being revived in recent years, several decades after the business closed down. My dad's business closed down. He closed it down in 1969. Or actually, he had sold the business a few years earlier, and MCA, which had bought it, closed it down in 1969. My dad was still managing it at that point. It never occurred to me to ask exactly what it was that prompted MCA to go to a different model of marketing his products. I think my dad's reputation rests on two big things. One was the fact that he made great instruments at a very affordable price that, although he wasn't thinking about this at the time, helped a number of, I think of them as just legions, an army of young people able to start the guitar because they could afford it and it was very playable. Some of them became serious about it and made a name for themselves as musicians. The other thing that makes my dad, I think, very special was the incredible range of innovations he introduced. He was way ahead of his time. When the factory was closed down, my dad kept only two guitars, no amplifiers. And my son has one of them. It's a Longhorn. And my stepbrother has the other. Both, and the other one is a sitar. I don't remember who has which. Anyhow, so we have still an electric sitar in the family and a Longhorn.
Wow.
So that's that little story.
Oh, boy. So thank you so much, Howard, for keeping
you are very welcome
and sharing the memory.
If you enjoyed today's show and appreciate 14 hours that I put in to produce this half hour, please subscribe and give me a review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts. And financially, your support could be best sent at Forever Pick on Reverb, where we sell the greatest pick on earth. And I challenge any pick company. This week's question. Ironically, 1690 only depends on one guitar, one amp, and wait to hear what he uses for pedals.
You're going on tour for a year. Your road manager says you could bring one guitar, one amp, and 3 pedals. What do you bring?
I bring my Signature Series guitar. I bring a TERASYNE MBT 100 head. I would bring an STE because I like the slant cabinet. I'm not a pedal guy. I'm a rack guy. So 2 things I don't ever not have in my rack: a Furman power conditioner and a tuner.
Cool. Thank you very much.
You got it, brother.
Honey, have you seen my scissors?
I borrowed them to fix the guitar, here.
Oh, well, I can't find the needle I was using either. Honey, you must have dropped that needle in the guitar.
Uh-oh.
Now you'll have to take it all apart.
Can you imagine looking for a needle in a guitar stack? So long, folks.
Peace and love worldwide. Live your life before your life lives you. Sunday. The upcoming vintage guitar shows will always be at the way end of the show because it is not evergreen content and I can remove it later without disrupting the body of the original broadcast. June 2nd, Lehigh Valley Guitar Show is at Harris Hall Agriplex in Allentown, Pennsylvania. June 10th, stop by the Montreal Guitar Show in Montreal. And June 23rd, the Gear and Guitar Musician Swap Meet. June 23rd at the Coos Rehearsal Studios on Beacon Street. June 24th, the Summer Ohio Guitar Show. It's in McCoy Center in Hillard, Ohio. June 28th, the Summer NAMM Show at the Music City Center in Nashville, Tennessee. June 30th, the Colorado Guitar Show and Custom Luthery Expo. That sounds awesome. At the Lutheran High School in Parker, Colorado.